A woman in her
Is there
early
anyone
40s
here?
stumbles through a snow-covered town park, breath
Please, I
uneven,
need help.
eyes searching for anyone to
No,
trust.
no,
She spots an older man on a worn bench
please,
and moves toward him
don't leave me.
instinctively. Nearby, a German
Sarah?
shepherd stops,
Help me.
ears rising,
Please,
no longer
David.
distracted,
They're here.
but focused on something
Stay
approaching
calm,
behind
Sarah.
her. Before we
Look at
continue,
me.
tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know your city. A late winter day settled quietly over a small town in Colorado, where heavy snow fell in thick, steady layers,
What is it,
covering
boy?
narrow streets,
What do you
wooden
see?
fences, and
You
the
shouldn't have
worn
come
paths of a nearly empty park, softening every sound until the world itself
been
seemed
waiting for you.
distant and hushed,
They're close
as
now.
if time had slowed under the weight of the storm. And on an old
many.
wooden bench near the center of that park sat David Miller,
You won't touch
a
her.
67-year-old former Navy SEAL whose presence carried a quiet, controlled strength that had never fully faded with age.
Enough.
His posture relaxed at first glance but held with subtle
Step aside, old
precision,
man.
the kind that suggested readiness even in stillness. His short gray hair was neatly cut, his jaw defined with a layer of coarse stubble, and his face, weathered by years of harsh environments and difficult choices, bore lines that told stories he never spoke aloud. His eyes, a muted steel blue, scanned the surroundings not out of anxiety, but out of habit, a discipline carved into him by years of service, where overlooking a detail could mean the difference between life and death. Beside him stood his German shepherd, Shadow, a 5-year-old dog with a strong, athletic build, thick, black and tan fur dusted with snow, and an alert posture that mirrored David's own, his ears upright, his gaze focused, not restless but precise, a dog trained not only through commands but through a deep bond of trust and instinct, the two of them existing in a quiet rhythm that required no words. David had lived in this town for over a decade now, in an old wooden house just a few blocks away, a structure that had aged alongside him, its faded walls and creaking porch a reflection of a life that had grown quieter with time. Since the passing of his wife 10 years ago, he had withdrawn from the world in ways that even he didn't fully acknowledge. Conversations became rare, connections thinner, and the town, though familiar, never truly became home again, except for the presence of Shadow, who filled the silence not by replacing what was lost, but by making it bearable. For a while, nothing disturbed the stillness. Snow continued to fall. The wind whispered softly through bare branches and the park remained nearly empty, until something shifted. It wasn't a sound at first, but a break in rhythm, a movement that didn't belong, and David's head turned slightly just enough to catch it. Footsteps, uneven and hurried, cutting through the snow with urgency rather than direction, and then she appeared, a woman moving quickly toward him, her pace unsteady, her breath visible in short, strained bursts. Sarah Collins, 43 years old, tall and slender, with a fragile frame that suggested both resilience and exhaustion, her dark brown hair pulled back loosely, strands falling across her pale face, her skin marked by the cold and something deeper, something internal that had worn her down over time, her green eyes wide, searching, not just for help, but for something solid, something safe. Her coat was not thick enough for the weather, and her hands trembled not only from the cold but from fear, the kind that lived beneath the surface and surfaced only when escape was no longer an option. She didn't slow as she approached, didn't hesitate or reconsider, as if something in David, something she couldn't explain, felt like the only place left to turn. She reached him and grabbed his sleeve, her grip tight, almost desperate, as though letting go would mean losing the last thread holding her together. Her voice came out in a strained whisper, barely steady but urgent enough to carry meaning beyond its softness. "Please, help me." David didn't react immediately. He didn't pull away, didn't offer reassurance. He simply looked at her, not just seeing her, but reading her. Years of experience telling him that fear like this wasn't imagined. It wasn't exaggerated. It was learned, repeated, ingrained. Shadow, however, had already shifted. His attention moved away from Sarah entirely. His body angled slightly, ears sharpening, his gaze locking onto something behind her. And that was when David followed, lifting his eyes past her shoulder, and saw them, 3 men, walking through the snow toward them with a deliberate, controlled pace, their presence cutting through the quiet like something out of place yet entirely certain of itself. The first man was tall and broad-shouldered, his shaved head reflecting the pale winter light, dark tattoos visible along his neck and creeping up toward his jawline, his expression calm in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. The second was heavier, his movements more aggressive, shoulders forward, eyes scanning with restless impatience, as if always waiting for an excuse to act. The third stayed slightly behind, leaner, quieter, his face narrow, his gaze sharp and calculating. Together, they formed a presence that didn't need to speak to be understood. They were not searching, they were retrieving. Sarah felt it before she turned, her grip on David tightening, her breath catching in her chest as the reality she had been running from closed in again. Her mind raced, fragments of memory flashing through her thoughts, the control, the threats, the constant sense of being watched, of never being able to truly leave, and now it was here again. Catching up to her, David stood slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, the movement small yet definitive. And as he rose, something in the space shifted, the quiet observer replaced by someone who understood exactly what was unfolding. Shadow moved with him, stepping forward slightly, positioning himself just ahead. His body tense but controlled, not aggressive, not reckless, but ready, always ready. Snow continued to fall around them, but now it felt heavier, thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. And David, without saying a word, took a half-step forward, placing himself between Sarah and the approaching men. The line had been drawn, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored. And in that moment, he was no longer just a man sitting on a bench in a quiet park. He was what he had always been when it mattered most, the one who stands when others cannot, the one who does not move aside, even when everything would be easier if he did. The snowfall did not ease. If anything, it grew denser, the wind shifting just enough to send fine sheets of white drifting across the park in slow, relentless waves. And the distance between stillness and danger narrowed into something sharp and immediate as David Miller stood with quiet certainty between Sarah Collins and the 3 approaching men, his posture unchanged yet unmistakably different from moments before, no longer passive, no longer simply present, but engaged in a way that came from instinct rather than decision. Sarah remained close behind him, her fingers still gripping the fabric of his sleeve, though now her hold had softened slightly, not because her fear had lessened, but because something in his stance had given her a fragile sense of grounding, her breathing still uneven, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts that refused to settle, her thoughts racing faster than she could contain, fragments of memory colliding in her mind, the locked doors, the quiet threats disguised as concern, the way her world had gradually shrunk without her fully noticing until there was nowhere left to go. And now, standing here, she felt the weight of everything she had escaped pressing back in from behind. David did not turn to face her fully, but his voice came low and steady, measured in a way that did not invite panic. "Tell me what happened." And though the words were simple, they carried a kind of control that made it easier for her to speak. Sarah swallowed hard, her lips parting before any sound came out, as if her voice had to push through layers of fear that had built up over time. He took everything," she began, her words uneven but driven by urgency rather than confusion. "After my husband died, I thought I was safe. I thought things would just settle." Her eyes dropped for a brief moment, as if the memory itself was something she could not look at directly. Mark Reynolds. He was my husband's business partner. He came around at first to help, Or at least that's what he said. He handled paperwork, finances, things I didn't understand. Her voice tightened slightly. The realization still fresh, even though it had been building for months. But then it changed, slowly. So slowly I didn't even see it happening. He started telling me what needed to be done, what I should sign, what decisions were best, and every time I hesitated, he would remind me how much I didn't know, how easy it would be to lose everything without him. David listened without interruption, his gaze still fixed forward, watching the men approach, but his attention divided with precision, taking in both the threat ahead and the truth behind him. Sarah continued, the words coming faster now, as if once they started, they could not be held back. He put cameras in the house, said it was for security, but I knew it wasn't. He always knew where I was, who I spoke to, when I left, when I came back. There was no space left that was mine. Her hands trembled again, not from the cold but from the memory of being constantly watched. He brought papers, contracts, things I didn't understand fully, and he would stand there until I signed them. Always calm, always patient, like he had all the time in the world. David's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Not in anger, but in recognition. He had seen control like that before, not loud, not explosive, but methodical. Designed to wear someone down until resistance felt pointless. And the threats? He asked quietly. Sarah nodded, her throat tightening as she forced the words out. Not direct, never direct. He never said he would hurt me, but the men he sent. They didn't have to say anything. They would just show up, stand there, follow me when I went out, remind me without speaking that I wasn't alone. Not ever. Behind them, Shadow remained perfectly still, his body angled toward the approaching figures, his focus unbroken. Each step the men took reflected subtly in the tension along his back, his ears fixed forward, reading movement before sound, instinct layered over training. The first man slowed slightly as they drew closer, his boots crunching through the snow with deliberate weight. His face unreadable, but his posture confident, as though he had done this many times before. The second man shifted his shoulders, glancing briefly at Shadow, a flicker of hesitation passing through him before it was quickly masked. The third remained quiet, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the distance, the positioning, the variables. Sarah's voice dropped lower now, almost fragile. I tried to leave before, she said. I packed a bag, I got in my car. I thought if I just drove far enough I could start over, but they were already waiting at the end of the street. The memory hit her harder this time, her breath catching as the image replayed in her mind, the feeling of being watched turning into the certainty of being trapped. They didn't touch me. They didn't have to. They just stood there until I turned around, and after that, I stopped trying. David exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but as a way to steady the moment. He understood now, not just the situation, but the pattern, the slow erosion of choice, the calculated removal of options until compliance became the only path left. And today? He asked. Sarah shook her head slightly, as if still trying to piece together how she had made it this far. He thought I would sign everything this morning, transfer the last part of the business, but something in me just broke. I couldn't do it anymore. I waited until he left the room, and I ran. Her grip on his sleeve tightened again, the fear returning in full force as the present caught up with her words. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get away. David nodded once, the motion small but decisive. Behind them, the men stopped just a few yards away now, close enough that their presence filled the space entirely. The first man tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Ma'am," he said, as if addressing a minor inconvenience rather than a situation already on the edge of escalation. "You're coming back now." The words landed flat, not loud, not aggressive, but final in their certainty. Sarah froze, her body instinctively pulling closer to David, her breathing shallow again, the instinct to run colliding with the knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. David did not move, did not respond immediately, but something in his stance shifted once more. Subtle, almost invisible, yet enough to signal that the line drawn moments ago had not only held, but hardened. And Shadow, without a sound, stepped forward half a pace, placing himself just ahead, his presence no longer passive, but protective in a way that needed no command. The snow continued to fall around them, but now every movement, every breath, every second felt sharpened, as if the world had narrowed down to this single moment, waiting for what would come next. The snow did not fall so much as it pressed down, thickening the air until every movement seemed to drag against it. And in that suspended stillness David Miller stood unmoving, his body positioned with quiet precision between Sarah Collins and the three men who had closed the distance to within a few yards. The space between them no longer open, but defined, measured, held in place by something that could not yet be seen, but was already understood. Sarah remained just behind him, her breathing shallow, uneven, her fingers still curled into the sleeve of his coat, as if the fabric itself could anchor her in a moment that threatened to slip away at any second. Her mind spiraling between past and present, each memory bleeding into the next, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the quiet click of doors that never truly locked, the feeling of being observed even in silence, and now, standing here, all of it converged into one unavoidable point. She forced her voice out despite the tremor that ran through it. "He's lying," she said, not loudly, but with a clarity that surprised even her, as if the truth, once spoken, had its own weight, its own presence. David did not turn to acknowledge her, but the slightest shift in his stance suggested he had heard everything he needed to hear. The first of the three men, the largest, took a slow step forward, his boots compressing the snow with deliberate force, his shaved head catching the muted light. The dark ink of tattoos coiling along his neck like something alive, his expression neutral, almost bored, but his eyes held a quiet calculation, the kind that belonged to someone used to testing limits. Beside him, the second man shifted his weight impatiently, broader, heavier, his shoulders angled forward as if his body naturally leaned into confrontation, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between David and Shadow with a mixture of irritation and uncertainty. The third remained a half step behind, lean and controlled, his movements minimal, his gaze sharper, more observant, as though he were less interested in intimidation and more in outcome. And then a fourth figure emerged from behind them, walking with a pace that did not match theirs. Slower, more composed, Mark Reynolds, a man in his early 50s, of average height but carrying himself with a confidence that made him appear taller, his dark hair neatly combed back, a few strands of gray at the temples adding to the image of control he carefully maintained, his face clean-shaven, features sharp but not harsh, the kind that could appear reassuring under the right circumstances. His coat was well-fitted, dark, unmarked by the snow, as if he had stepped out of a different world entirely. His eyes settled first on Sarah, not with concern but with something closer to ownership, then shifted to David with a measured curiosity, as though evaluating an unexpected variable. When he spoke, his voice was calm, even warm, but the warmth felt constructed, like something practiced rather than felt. "Sarah," he said, as if addressing a misunderstanding rather than a crisis, "you shouldn't be out here like this." She flinched at the sound of her name, her body tightening instinctively, memories surfacing uninvited, the tone he used when others were watching, the way concern could be shaped into control. "She's not thinking clearly," Mark continued, his gaze now on David, his tone shifting slightly, more explanatory, more persuasive. It's been a difficult time for her. After her husband passed, she hasn't been herself. I've been trying to help her manage things, keep everything stable. The words were smooth, carefully chosen, each one placed to create a version of reality that sounded reasonable, even compassionate. Sarah shook her head quickly, her voice breaking through before fear could silence it again. "That's not true," she said, her breath catching. "He's lying," David finally spoke. His voice low, steady, carrying no trace of emotion yet, leaving no room for interpretation. "She stays." The simplicity of it cut through the layered explanations, reducing everything to a single, immovable point. Mark paused, just briefly, the smallest flicker of irritation crossing his expression before it was quickly smoothed away. "You don't understand the situation," he replied, his tone still controlled but edged now with something firmer. "This is a family matter, and I would advise you not to involve yourself in something you don't fully grasp." David did not respond immediately, his silence not empty but deliberate, a refusal to engage on terms that did not matter. The heavier man to Mark's right shifted again, his patience thinning. "This doesn't concern you," he muttered, taking a step forward, and that was when Shadow moved. It happened faster than the eye could fully track. A sharp, precise motion, his body lunging forward just enough, his jaws snapping closed in the air inches from the man's leg. The sound cutting through the muffled quiet of the snow like a crack, not a bite, not an attack, but a warning delivered with absolute clarity. The man recoiled instantly, his balance faltering as he stumbled back a half step, a curse slipping under his breath. His earlier confidence fractured in a way he could not fully hide. The second man froze, his eyes locking onto Shadow, his posture tightening, every instinct telling him that another step would not end the same way. The third man did not move, but his gaze sharpened, reassessing, recalculating. Mark's expression changed again, not dramatically but enough for the shift to register. The calm facade thinning as he took in the new balance of the situation. His eyes moved from Shadow to David, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition, perhaps, that this would not resolve as easily as he had intended. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," Mark said quietly, his voice lower now, less performative, more direct. "There are ways to handle this without escalation." David met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "You can leave," he said, the words simple, but carrying the same weight as before. No threat, no raised voice, just a statement of fact. For a moment, no one moved, the snow continuing its steady descent, the world around them reduced to this single, suspended exchange. And then, in the distance, faint at first but unmistakable, the sound of a siren cut through the silence, growing gradually louder as it approached along the road beyond the park. The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The second man glanced over his shoulder, tension replacing irritation. The heavier one exhaled sharply. Stepping back without thinking, Mark remained still for a second longer, his jaw tightening just slightly as the situation moved beyond his control. He looked at Sarah once more, not with concern, but with a cold, measured promise, then back at David. "This isn't over," he said. The calm gone from his voice now, replaced by something harder, more honest, and without another word he turned, the three men falling in behind him, their earlier certainty replaced by a quieter, more cautious retreat. Within moments they were gone, their figures dissolving into the falling snow, and though the park returned to silence, it was not the same silence as before. Something had shifted, something that would not simply settle back into place. Shadow remained where he was, his body still angled toward the direction they had disappeared, his vigilance unbroken, while David stood unmoving for a moment longer, ensuring that the distance was real, that the threat had truly withdrawn, and only then did the tension in his posture ease, just slightly, enough to signal that, for now, the line had held. The snow had begun to settle into a quieter fall by the time David Miller and Sarah Collins left the park. The storm no longer aggressive but steady, as if the world itself had exhaled after holding tension too long. The town stretched before them in muted tones of white and gray, streetlights flickering on one by one as evening approached, and David walked slightly ahead, not rushing, not looking back often, but always aware of where Sarah was, his pace measured in a way that allowed her to keep up without feeling left behind. Shadow moved close at his side, occasionally glancing behind them, not out of fear but out of habit, ensuring the space they had left remained empty. Sarah followed with a stiffness that came not from the cold, but from the aftershock of what had just happened, her body still carrying the echo of adrenaline, her mind struggling to accept that, for the moment, she was not being followed, not being watched, and yet the feeling refused to fully disappear. It lingered, embedded too deeply to fade in a single moment. David's house stood at the edge of a quiet street lined with aging wooden homes, its structure worn but stable. The paint faded into a soft gray, the porch slightly uneven, and a single warm light glowing through the window. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the faint scent of wood and thyme. The living room simple and unadorned, a stone fireplace against one wall, a few framed photographs resting on a shelf, their surfaces lightly coated with dust, as if they had not been moved in years. Sarah hesitated at the doorway for a brief moment, as though crossing the threshold required more than just a step. It required trust, and trust was something she had learned to withhold. But she stepped in anyway, slowly, her eyes moving across the room, taking in details without fully focusing on any of them. David closed the door behind them with a quiet click, the sound soft but final, a separation from the outside that did not yet feel complete. "Sit," he said, his tone calm, not commanding but certain. Sarah moved toward the couch, lowering herself carefully, her hands still close to her body, fingers curling and uncurling without purpose. Shadow positioned himself near the door, not lying down, not relaxing, simply watching, as if the boundary between inside and outside had not yet been secured in his mind. David moved to the fireplace, adding a piece of wood, the small action grounding the space, giving it a rhythm that did not depend on fear. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence, our son stretching, not empty but heavy with everything that had not yet been said, until Sarah finally broke it, her voice softer now, less urgent but more fragile. "He has cameras," she said, her eyes still fixed somewhere beyond the room, inside the house, in places you wouldn't expect. David turned slightly, his attention shifting fully to her now. "Where?" he asked, not as a question of doubt but of direction. Sarah took a breath, forcing herself to focus. "The living room, near the hallway, and the office. He keeps everything there, documents, records, things he doesn't want anyone to see." She paused, her brow tightening as she searched through memory. "He showed me once, when he was drinking, like he was proud of it." David nodded once, the pieces aligning quickly in his mind, the pattern clear: control, surveillance, documentation, not random, not impulsive, but structured, intentional. "Do you remember how to get in?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The code, yes." Her voice lowered slightly as if even speaking it aloud carried risk. David stepped away from the fireplace, his decision forming without hesitation. "Then we go tonight." Sarah's head lifted quickly, surprise cutting through her fatigue. "Now?" she asked, uncertainty returning. David's expression remained steady. "Before he has time to change anything," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not a suggestion. It was the only window they had. The house stood quiet when they arrived, the lights off, the snow around it undisturbed, as if nothing had happened, as if the events of the day had left no mark on the surface. David approached the door without rushing, his movements precise. Sarah stayed a step behind, her breath shallow again, the familiarity of the place clashing with the fear attached to it. She entered the code with trembling fingers, the keypad beeping softly before the lock clicked open, the sound louder than it should have been in the silence. Inside, the air felt different. Colder, not in temperature, but in presence, like a space that had been used without warmth. Shadow entered first, his nose low, his steps careful, mapping the environment in a way that no human could replicate. David followed, scanning each corner, each shadow, ensuring the house was empty. They moved through the room slowly, deliberately, Sarah guiding him toward the office, her steps hesitant, each one carrying memory, until they reached it. The door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was organized to a fault, shelves lined with folders, a desk cleared of anything unnecessary, the kind of order that suggested control rather than care. David moved to the cabinet Sarah had indicated, opening it carefully. Inside, he found the first camera system, wires, storage devices, everything in place, but Shadow did not stop. He moved further, pausing at a drawer, standing still, his attention fixed. David followed. Opening it, inside were documents. At first ordinary, contracts, financial records, but as he flipped through them, patterns began to emerge. Inconsistencies, signatures that did not match, transfers that made no sense, and then something else. A folder thinner than the rest, almost overlooked. He opened it, and inside were printed emails, letters, all addressed the same way. Mom. The word alone shifted the air in the room. Sarah stepped closer, her breath catching as she looked down, her hands hovering, afraid to touch. David handed her one, and she read, her eyes moving slowly as if each word required effort to process. Mom, I tried to come back. I didn't understand why you wouldn't answer. I thought maybe you didn't want me anymore. Her voice broke, the realization hitting in fragments, each one heavier than the last. These are from Ethan, she whispered, her knees weakening as she sank into the chair behind her, the truth rearranging everything she thought she knew. He didn't leave. He was trying to find me. David said nothing, the evidence speaking for itself. The silence now filled with something deeper than fear, something closer to loss rediscovered. Sarah lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as tears finally broke through. Not the quiet tears of fear, but the uncontrollable release of something that had been buried for too long, and in that moment, the past she believed was gone. Shifted, revealing something that had never truly disappeared. The night carried forward without rest, as if the discovery inside Mark Reynolds' house had shifted something that could no longer be contained by silence, and by the time David Miller and Sarah Collins returned to his old wooden home, the snow had slowed into a soft, almost weightless fall, the kind that no longer concealed movement but revealed it. Each footprint clear, each path visible. Sarah moved through the doorway differently this time, not with hesitation, but with urgency that came from a fragile, growing clarity. Her hands still trembled, but now they carried purpose instead of confusion. The emails she had read replayed in her mind in fragments that refused to settle. Each word from Ethan reshaping years of belief she had built around abandonment, loss, and silence. She sank into the same chair as before, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders no longer curved inward in defense, but held forward slightly as if she were bracing herself to face something instead of retreat from it. David set the documents carefully on the table, arranging them not out of habit, but out of necessity, each piece now part of something larger than either of them alone. "We need to move quickly," he said, his voice steady, his tone unchanged. But there was a sharper edge to it now, not urgency driven by fear, but by timing. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers. "Will this be enough?" she asked, her voice quieter, but no longer breaking. David considered for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but out of precision. "It's enough to start," he replied, "and once it starts, it won't stop." The call was made shortly after. Not to the local station directly, but to someone David trusted to understand the difference between noise and evidence, Detective Laura Bennett, a woman in her mid-40s with a composed demeanor shaped by years of working cases that rarely presented themselves cleanly. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, her face defined by sharp cheekbones and a gaze that missed little. She had built a reputation not on force, but on patience, the kind that allowed her to see patterns others overlooked. When she arrived, she stepped into the house without hesitation, her posture straight, her movements efficient, her eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on Sarah, then on David. "You said you had something solid," she said, her tone direct, not unfriendly but not soft either. David gestured to the documents. "It's more than just control," he explained. "There's fraud, manipulation, coercion, and evidence of intercepted communication." Laura moved closer, flipping through the papers with practiced speed, her expression tightening slightly as the pattern revealed itself. "He's been building this for a while," she said, more to herself than to them. Sarah watched, her breath steady, but her hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to the moment itself. Laura looked up, her gaze meeting Sarah's. "You're ready to make a statement?" she asked, not as a question of willingness, but of readiness. Sarah hesitated for only a second, then nodded. Yes, the word simple, but anchored. The process moved quickly after that, faster than Sarah had expected. Officers arrived, quiet but deliberate, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. The house filled with controlled motion, evidence collected, statements recorded, and within hours, the shift from hidden control to visible accountability had begun. Mark Reynolds was taken into custody before dawn. The arrest not dramatic, not resistant, but final, his composure still intact, though something beneath it had changed, the confidence no longer absolute. His eyes flicked once toward the officers, then toward the distance beyond them, calculating. But this time, the outcome was not his to control. The news reached Sarah not through speculation but through confirmation. Laura, returning with a brief nod, "He's in custody," she said. And for a moment, Sarah did not react. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much, the weight of it settling slowly. Not as relief, but as space, a space where fear no longer filled every corner. The next step came quietly, almost carefully, as Laura placed a phone on the table. "We found a number connected to the emails," she said, her tone softer now. "It's recent." Sarah's breath caught, her fingers hovering before she reached for it, the screen already dialed, as if the moment had been waiting. The call connected after only a few rings, and then a voice, hesitant, uncertain, but unmistakably real. "Hello," Ethan, 22 years old, his voice deeper than she remembered, carrying the weight of years spent trying to understand absence without answers. Sarah's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came, her eyes filling before words could form. "Ethan," she whispered, the name fragile, as if saying it too loudly might break something. There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Mom," the word came out with disbelief, not doubt, but shock, that something long unreachable had suddenly become real. The conversation that followed was not smooth, not structured, but it didn't need to be. It was built from fragments, from questions left unanswered for too long, from explanations that could not fully repair what had been lost, but could begin to bridge it. By the time they met in person, the snow had nearly stopped. The town quiet again, but different, as if something beneath it had shifted. Ethan stood near the edge of the street, taller than she expected, lean but solid, his dark hair slightly unkempt, his features carrying a resemblance she recognized instantly despite the years, his eyes searching her face with a mix of hope and caution, as if afraid the moment might dissolve if he moved too quickly. Sarah stepped toward him slowly, each step measured, not out of hesitation, but out of disbelief that the distance between them was finally closing. And when they reached each other, the embrace was not perfect, not practiced, but real, held together by everything that had been missing, everything that had been misunderstood. David stood on the porch of his old house, watching from a distance, his posture relaxed for the first time in a way that did not feel temporary. Something in the space around him had changed. The quiet, no longer empty, but filled with something steady, something that did not need to be named. Shadow lay nearby, his body no longer tense, his eyes half-lidded, aware but at rest. The line he had held no longer needed, and as Sarah turned back toward David, her expression softened, not free of everything she had carried, but lighter, grounded in something new. "You gave me back everything I thought I lost," she said, her voice steady, no longer fragile, and this time the words did not carry urgency. They carried truth. The days that followed did not arrive with sudden change, but with a quiet, steady shift, like the way snow eventually gives way to the faint outline of paths beneath it. And the town, once muted and distant, began to feel different, not because it had changed, but because the people within it had. Sarah Collins no longer moved through space as someone searching for escape, but as someone learning how to remain. Her posture still held traces of what she had endured, a slight tension in her shoulders, a hesitation before entering unfamiliar rooms. But there was something new beneath it, something steady, something that did not disappear the moment she looked away. She spent her mornings at David Miller's house, the old wooden structure that had once felt like a place frozen in time now slowly taking on a different rhythm. The walls still bore their age. The floor still creaked with every step. But the silence that once filled it had begun to fracture, replaced by small, consistent sounds, conversation, movement, the occasional laughter that came unexpectedly and lingered longer than either of them anticipated. David himself had not set out to change anything, yet the change had found him regardless. He moved through the house differently now, not as someone occupying space out of habit, but as someone aware of its purpose. Tools that had once gathered dust were brought back into use, shelves cleared, broken fixtures repaired, his hands working with the same precision they always had, but now, guided by something beyond routine. Ethan visited often, his presence tentative at first, as though unsure how much of himself he was allowed to bring into a life that had been interrupted for so long. He was taller than David by a few inches, lean but solid, his features carrying both youth and the weight of years spent navigating confusion alone. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, often pushed back in a gesture that revealed a quiet restlessness. Yet beneath it there was a sincerity that had not been broken, only delayed. He watched his mother closely in those early days, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to confirm that she was truly there, that the distance between them had not simply shifted into another form. Sarah noticed it, of course she did, and though she could not erase the years that had passed, she met his gaze each time with a steadiness that slowly, gradually, began to rebuild something neither of them had words for yet. The idea came not as a sudden decision, but as a thought that returned repeatedly, persistent, quiet, until it could no longer be ignored. "There are others," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice calm but certain. "People who don't get out. People who stay where I was because they think there's no way out." David looked at her, not questioning the truth of it, only the form it would take. "And what do you want to do about that?" he asked. Sarah's hands rested lightly on the table, no longer trembling. "I want to give them somewhere to go," she replied. The words simple, but grounded in something that had been forming long before she spoke them aloud. The house itself became the starting point, not because it was ideal, but because it was available, familiar, and already holding more than it once had. They cleared the front room first, removing furniture that had no purpose, opening the space so that it no longer felt enclosed. The old fireplace became a center point again, not just for warmth, but for presence. Word spread quietly at first, not through announcements but through conversations, one person telling another, the kind of information that travels without needing to be pushed. The first to arrive was a woman named Helen Carter, in her late 50s, her posture slightly bent from years of carrying more than her share, her gray hair tied loosely at the back of her neck, her hands rough from work, her eyes cautious but observant. She stepped inside slowly, as if expecting to be turned away, but Sarah met her at the door, not with questions, not with demands, just with a quiet acknowledgement that she was allowed to be there. Helen did not speak much at first. She sat near the edge of the room, her gaze shifting between the door and the floor. But over time, the tension in her shoulders eased. Not completely, but enough. More people followed. Some stayed only briefly, others returned, each carrying their own version of what Sarah had once lived through. David did not involve himself in their stories unless asked. His role different, but no less important. He maintained the structure, ensured the space remained safe, functional, reliable. The kind of presence that did not draw attention but was always there when needed. Shadow adapted in a way that required no instruction. He no longer positioned himself near the door as he once had, his vigilance replaced by something softer, more attuned to the emotional shifts within the room. He would sit near those who spoke the least, his presence steady, unintrusive. And it became clear over time that people trusted him before they trusted anyone else. Children especially, though there were not many, found their way to him first, drawn not by invitation, but by the absence of pressure. And through that, the space began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, like something being rebuilt piece by piece. David noticed it in ways he had not expected. The house no longer echoed in the same way. The quiet that once felt heavy now carried weight differently. It was no longer something to endure, but something to share. And in those moments, standing in the doorway, watching conversations unfold that had nothing to do with him, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. That purpose did not always come from action. Sometimes it came from simply remaining where you were needed. The afternoon light softened as snow began to fall again. Not harsh, not overwhelming, but gentle, steady, settling over the town in a way that felt almost deliberate. Inside the house, the fire burned low but constant, casting a warm glow across the room. Sarah sat near the window, Ethan beside her, their conversation quiet, unforced. David leaned against the wall nearby, his posture relaxed, no longer defined by readiness alone. Shadow lay at their feet, his eyes half closed, aware but at peace, and for a moment everything held, not perfectly, not without the past still present in quiet ways, but stable. Enough. Sarah looked out at the falling snow, then back at the room around her, her voice soft but certain. "Maybe I didn't lose my life," she said, her words not searching, but settling. "Maybe I was just being led to the right place." And this time, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as something sudden or impossible. They arrive quietly through people placed in our path at the exact moment we need them most. A stranger who chooses not to walk away, a voice that listens when everything else has been silent, a presence that stands beside us when we feel completely alone. And maybe that is how God works in our lives, not always through signs we can clearly see, but through ordinary moments that become extraordinary because someone cared enough to act. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to reach out to someone in your life. A simple message or a kind word can become the miracle they have been waiting for. Share this story with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if you believe in stories that remind us we are never truly alone, consider subscribing to the channel. Wherever you are, may God watch over you, bring peace to your home, and guide your steps in the days ahead.